Each night, a candle is lit, and the whispering tomes open. Inside are the strange, the forgotten, the stories time tried to silence. Some say history is written by the victors, but here the lost are given voice. Breathe deeply and follow me into the hidden chapters of history.
Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches' opening. A book leaves the Prescomini near the end of the 15th century. Inside a printing workshop, the air carries the smell of oil, wood, damp paper, and fresh black ink. A wooden press stands beneath heavy beams. Nearby, individual pieces of metal type have been arranged into lines of Latin. Sheets of paper are placed carefully into position. The press is tightened, released, opened again. Another page is finished, then another. The work is slow by modern standard, but astonishingly fast compared with the labor of the manuscript copyist, only a few generations earlier. A book of this size might have required months of careful work by hand. Every page copied individually, every letter formed by a pen. Now, identical pages can be made again and again, and sometime around the years. 1,487 presses in the German-speaking lands begin producing copies of a book whose reputation will survive for more than 5 centuries. Its title is printed in Latin Malleus Maleficarum, usually translated today as the Hammer of Witches. It is not a book of spells. It is not a secret grimoire, and it was not written by witches. It was written against them. Its pages attempt to explain what witches supposedly are, what powers they possess, how they enter into agreement with demons, how accusations against them should be investigated, and how authorities might bring them to trial. It combines theology, folklore, legal procedure, rumor, older writings, and the personal convictions of one exceptionally determined Dominican inquisitor. His name is Heinrich Kramer. In Latin documents, he often appears as Henricus in stories. For centuries, another Dominican, Jacob Sprenger, would be presented beside him as the book's co-author. His name appeared on later editions, and generations accepted the partnership. Modern historians are much less certain. Some doubt Sprenger had any meaningful role in writing the book at all, but there is little uncertainty about Kramer. His presence runs through the work, his arguments, his frustrations, his experiences as an inquisitor, and repeatedly his conviction that a terrible crime was spreading through Christian society while too many judges, priests, scholars, and local officials failed to take it seriously. To Kramer, witchcraft was not merely an old rural superstition. It was not simply the use of charms, curses, or forbidden magic. He believed something far more organized and far more dangerous was taking place. He believed certain men and women had entered deliberately into the service of the devil, and he believed they could be found, questioned, prosecuted, and punished. The Malleus Maleficarum would provide an argument for doing exactly that. Yet, the world into which the book appeared was more complicated than its reputation sometimes suggests. Europe did not suddenly discover witches because one book was printed, nor did every medieval priest, theologian, or judge share Kramer's beliefs. Ideas about magic had existed for centuries, so had skepticism. Church authorities had long condemned certain supernatural practices, but they had not always agreed about what those practices meant, whether extraordinary claims should be believed, or how seriously particular accusations should be taken. The great European witch hunts were still largely in the future. The enormous waves of prosecution, most often associated with witchcraft, would belong primarily to the early modern centuries that followed. The Malleus appeared near a turning point. Old beliefs were being reorganized. Older fears were being joined together. And the printing press could now carry an argument farther than almost any medieval author could have imagined. For the moment, however, the newly printed pages simply accumulate. They are folded, gathered, bound, carried away. Some will reach monasteries, some universities, some judges, some clergy, some scholars. Other copies will disappear entirely. 5 centuries later, surviving editions will rest behind glass. Their pages browned with age, but the ideas printed upon them belong to a very particular world. To understand the hammer of which we first have to enter that world. Not a world in which everyone believed the same things, but one in which the borders between religion, magic, medicine, rumor, law, and everyday fear could look very different from the borders we recognize today. And so, before we open the Malleus Maleficarum, we begin several centuries before its publication, with the long and complicated history of magic in Christian Europe. Before the Hammerlong, before Heinrich Kramer put his arguments into print, Europeans already possessed a large vocabulary for explaining misfortune. A field failed, milk spoiled, an animal became sick, a child developed a fever, a storm destroyed a crop, a marriage produced no children, someone suffered unexplained pain. Today, many of these events can be described through meteorology, medicine, biology, or simple probability. In medieval Europe, those explanations were either unavailable or existed. Beside an entirely different understanding of the world, Christian teaching placed human life within a universe filled with spiritual beings, God, angels, saints, demons, the devil. Prayer was not an abstract exercise. It belonged to ordinary life. Church bells divided the hours. Saints' days shaped the calendar. Religious images stood inside churches and homes. Relics drew pilgrims across long distances. Blessings might be sought for fields, livestock, marriages, journeys, illness, and childbirth. The supernatural was not necessarily understood as something outside the normal world. For many people, it was part of the structure of that world. But that did not mean every supernatural claim was accepted for centuries. Christian authorities had struggled to distinguish legitimate religious practice from superstition, forbidden, magic fraught, and older traditions that continued beneath the surface of Christian society. The distinctions were not always simple. Walk through a European village in the later Middle Ages and many different practices might exist within a surprisingly small area. A priest performs the recognized rites of the church. A local healer knows plants used for fever or wounds. A mother remembers a protective saying taught by her own mother. A farmer observes particular customs when planting or harvesting. Someone carries an object believed to offer protection. Another person seeks help recovering something that has been stolen. A charm may contain Christian words. A healing ritual may invoke the name of a saint. An astrologer studies the movement of the heavens. A university scholar reads ancient works describing properties hidden within nature. And somewhere nearby, someone may be accused of causing harm through magic. These things did not all belong to a single category. Medieval people distinguished among them, although those distinctions changed across time and place. Magic could mean learnt practices found in books. It could mean common charms and remedies. It could mean divination, attempts to discover hidden information, attempts to influence events, attempts to summon or command spirits. And it could mean Maleficium, harmful magic. The word is important. Maleficium referred to wrongdoing or harmful. Sorcery. Magic believed to injure another person, animal, or property. Be a dead cow, a ruined harvest, an unexplained illness, the sudden inability of a newly married couple to have intercourse. Such events might, under certain circumstances, become the foundation of an accusation. But the person blamed for them was not yet necessarily the fully developed satanic witch that would appear in later demonological writing. That image had to be constructed slowly from several different traditions. One of them was the old fear of harmful magic. Another was Christian demonology, the study and description of demons and their supposed interaction with humanity. Another came from ideas about heresy. This connection would become particularly important. Medieval church authorities had considerable experience pursuing groups they considered heretical. Heresy was not simply disagreement. From the church's perspective, persistent rejection of accepted doctrine could threaten the religious unity of Christian society. Investigators developed ways of questioning suspects. Legal thinkers debated standards of evidence. Authorities attempted to identify secret beliefs in hidden communities. Descriptive heretics sometimes included accusations of secret nighttime gathering, sexual misconduct, rejection of Christian rites, or worship of evil power. Such accusations were not always accurate descriptions of real behavior, but the language existed, and over time, parts of that language began to attach themselves to witchcraft. The change was gradual. It did not happen everywhere. At once, even educated authorities disagreed. Some inherited older teachings that treated extraordinary tales of nighttime, supernatural travel with deep suspicion. People might sincerely believe they had flown through the darkness, or traveled with mysterious supernatural figures. But some clerical writers regarded such experiences as dreams, illusions, or deceptions rather than physical journey. The devil, they argued, might deceive the mind. That was different from saying that a human body actually arose from the ground and crossed miles of countryside during the night. This distinction mattered, because later witch theorists would increasingly insist that extraordinary acts attributed to witches could be physically real. The witch could travel. The witch could meet with demons. The witch could cause physical injury. The witch could interfere with reproduction. The witch could bring storms. The witch could kill animals. And behind these acts, according to the developing theory, stood an even more serious offense. A deliberate agreement with the devil. This transformed the accusation. A person who used a harmful charm was one kind of offender. A person believed to have rejected Christianity and entered the service of Satan was something much larger. The supposed crime could now contain magic, heresy, apostasy, and conspiracy at once. And by the 15th century, writers in parts of Europe were beginning to describe exactly this kind of witch. The change can be seen in texts written before the Malleus. One particularly important work was the Formicarius, written by the Dominican theologian Johannes Nieder during the first half of the 15th century. Nieder discussed stories of witchcraft that already contained elements recognizable from later trials, secret gatherings, demonic influence, renunciation of Christianity, harm performed through supernatural means. The image was becoming clearer, yet there was still no single European doctrine of witchcraft. Regional beliefs differed, legal systems differed, judges differed, theologians differed. A charge that might be dismissed in one place could be treated seriously in another, and the majority of people who would eventually die during Europe's large witch persecutions had not yet been accused. The most intense period was still generations away. For now, the 15th century landscape remained uneven. Along a road outside a town, carts move between fields and gates. A church bell carries over the roofs. Smoke rises from household fires. Merchants arrive with cloth, salt, wine, tools, and books. News travels with them. So do stories. Stories of illness, of curses, of strange animals, of unexplained deaths, of neighbors whose arguments ended in unexpected misfortune. Most such stories vanish without ever entering a courtroom. Some do not. Local hostility can give an old rumor a name. A name can produce an accusation. And once an accusation reaches authorities who already believe that harmful magic is possible, an ordinary dispute can become something much more dangerous. Still, one important obstacle remains. Belief alone is not enough. Someone must decide what counts as evidence. Someone must decide which stories are credible. Someone must question witnesses. Someone must determine whether the exe said has committed a crime at all. And this is where the history of witchcraft moves from folklore into law. During the later Middle Ages, European legal procedures were changing in some jurisdictions. Authorities could investigate serious crimes rather than waiting entirely upon private accusers. Witness testimony could be gathered. Suspects could be interrogated. Learned jurists attempted to classify offenses and establish procedures for proving them under particular circumstances. Torture could be legally permitted as part of an investigation. Though its rules and application differed greatly across jurisdictions and periods, this created a dangerous problem when applied to imagined secret crimes. Ordinary offenses might leave physical evidence: a stolen object, a wound, a body, a witness. But how does a court prove an invisible agreement between a human being and a demon? How? Does one prove that a storm was caused deliberately? How does one distinguish illness from sorcery? How does one prove what supposedly happened at a secret gathering where, by definition, respectable witnesses were absent? These questions would occupy witchcraft theorists for generations. The answers they developed could make accusations self-reinforcing. Secrecy became evidence of conspiracy. Denial could be interpreted as stubbornness. An inability to produce ordinary evidence could be explained by the extraordinary nature of the crime itself, and confession became enormously valuable. Once one accused person supplied names, new investigations could begin. One accusation might lead to another, then another. Later, under the right legal, religious, and social conditions. This process would help entire witch panics expand across communities. But Europe had not yet reached the height of that phenomenon. In the middle decades of the 15th century, scholars were still collecting ideas that later writers would systematize. The invention of European movable type printing would soon give those writers something their predecessors had never possessed: scale before printing. A complicated theological treatise had to travel as a manuscript. A copyist reproduced it. Then perhaps another distribution was limited by time, labor, materials, and access. Printing altered that equation. A controversial argument could now be reproduced in hundreds of nearly identical copies. One city could supply readers far beyond its walls. New editions could appear elsewhere. Errors could be repeated. Claims could be repeated. Stories could be repeated. Authority itself could be man. Chapter 2: Heinrich Kramer and the Failed Witch Trial of Innsbrucken, the summer of 1485. Heinrich Kramer arrived in Innsbruck with authority, confidence, and a purpose. The city lay beneath the mountains of Tyrol, surrounded by steep slopes and narrow valleys. Merchants passed through its streets. Church bells marked the hours. Beyond the walls, farms climbed toward the lower hills, while snow remained visible on the higher peaks. Even when the valley below was green dot, Kramer had not come as an ordinary preacher. He was a Dominican inquisitor, charged with investigating heresy, and he believed witchcraft had become one of the gravest hidden threats within Christian society. Only the year before, Pope Innocent VIII had issued a bull known as Summis Desiderantes. It confirmed the authority of Kramer and his fellow inquisitor Jacob Sprenger to act against people accused of certain forms of witchcraft in parts of the German lands. For Kramer, the document was more than administrative support. It strengthened a belief he already held with great certainty. Witches were real, their crimes were serious, and resistance to their prosecution allowed evil to spread. So in Innsbruck, Kramer preached. He spoke publicly about witchcraft and urged people to report by those they suspected. Accusations followed. Old quarrels, rumors, unexplained illnesses, hostile words, and stories of harmful magic began to move from private conversation toward formal investigation. Several women became the focus of Kramer's attention. Among them was Helena Schäuberin. She was not an isolated beggar living beyond the edge of town, nor a mysterious outsider who had recently arrived. Helena was an Innsbruck woman, married to Sebastian Schäuber, a prosperous citizen of the city, and she appears to have had little fear of Heinrich Kramer. According to surviving records, she refused to attend his sermons. She encouraged others to stay away as well. On one occasion, she publicly insulted him in the street. Kramer did not forget it. To him, her hostility was not merely rude behavior. It could be interpreted as resistance to the work of the Inquisition itself. Soon, investigators began collecting accusations against her. The most serious concerned the death of a man named James Spies. Spies became ill, and the illness was interpreted by some as the result of sorcery. After his death, suspicion settled upon Helena. There was no physical evidence of witchcraft. There could not be. The accusation depended upon testimony, reputation, circumstance, and the belief that an invisible act could produce a visible death. This was precisely the kind of case that would come to define the problem of prosecuting witchcraft. If magic left no ordinary evidence, how could a court distinguish a supernatural crime from illness, coincidence, resentment, or rumor? Kramer believed that such crimes could be uncovered, but Innsbruck would show him that belief was not enough. By autumn, formal proceedings were underway. On October 29, 1485, officials gathered in the town hall. The room would have been familiar to the civic authorities who entered it. Timber, plaster, benches, tables, documents, ink, and the subdued movement of men preparing to hear testimony. Among those present were trained churchmen and legal officials, including representatives connected to Georg Golsa, the Bishop of Brixen, whose diocese included Innsbruck. Kramer was there as inquisitor. Helena Schäuber was brought before them. What followed became one of the most important moments in the history of the Malleus Maleficarum. Kramer began questioning her. At first, the questions concerned her life and reputation. Then the interrogation moved toward sexuality. Kramer asked about intimate matters, including her sexual conduct. The questions were not incidental to his thinking. Kramer increasingly connected witchcraft with sexual behavior, temptation, reproduction, and women. These ideas would later occupy some of the most notorious passages of the Malleus, but in Innsbruck other men in the room did not simply accept his approach. Objections were raised. The proceedings were challenged on legal grounds. The questioning was criticized. The evidence against the accused women was considered inadequate. Kramer had arrived expecting cooperation from local authorities. Instead, he found men who were unwilling to treat every accusation as proof of a hidden, satanic crime. This distinction is important. The collapse of the Innsbruck proceedings did not mean that everyone present rejected the possibility of witchcraft. A 15th century lawyer or bishop could believe that harmful magic existed and still reject a particular prosecution. The issue was not only belief, it was evidenced of procedure, jurisdiction, and the conduct of the inquisitor himself. As the hearings continued, Kramer's position weakened. A legal advocate challenged the case against the women, and the proceedings failed to produce the convictions Kramer wanted. The accused were eventually released from the prosecution. For Kramer, this was not a minor setback. He had come to Innsbruck carrying papal authority and expecting to expose witches instead. Local resistance had stopped him. Bishop Georg Golsa became increasingly concerned. Golsa had not begun as an enemy of Kramer. He had allowed the investigation to proceed and had sent representatives to observe it, but his correspondence reveals growing distrust of the inquisitor's methods and judgment. The bishop ultimately ordered Kramer to leave. Kramer resisted for a time. Then, in the months that followed, he departed Tyrol. The streets of Innsbruck grew quiet again. The women Kramer had pursued were not sent to the stake. No great witch hunt followed there. The episode could have ended as a local failure, preserved in a few documents and remembered by specialists, but instead, Kramer carried the failure with him, and this is where the story changes. He did not leave. Innsbruck persuaded that he had been too aggressive. He did not conclude that the accusations had been unreliable. He did not decide that perhaps his understanding of witchcraft required reconsideration. The opposite appears to have happened. Kramer became more determined to explain why witchcraft was real, why skepticism toward it was dangerous, and why judges should possess clear methods for investigating and prosecuting it. The resistance he had encountered became part of the problem he wanted to solve. There were, in his view, not only witches. There were also people who refused to believe strongly enough in witches, judges who hesitated, clergy who doubted, officials who demanded forms of evidence that secret supernatural crimes were unlikely to provide. If those people could be persuaded, future prosecutions might not end as Innsbruck had, and so the failed trial became something larger. It became an argument during the months after Innsbruck. Kramer began assembling theology, legal procedure, stories of alleged witchcraft, earlier authorities, and examples drawn from his own experience. Some of those examples would return directly to the accusations he had investigated. The result would be organized into three broad parts. An argument that witchcraft truly existed, and that denying its reality was dangerous. Second, a description of what witches supposedly did and how their magic was believed to work. Third, instructions concerning investigation, interrogation, trial, and punishment. Kramer was no longer trying to persuade one courtroom through print. He could address hundreds of readers, perhaps thousands. The failure at Innsbruck had shown him the limits of personal authority. A bishop could resist him. A lawyer could interrupt him. A local court could refuse to convict. But a book could travel where he could not. It could sit on the desk of a judge he would never meet. It could enter a monastery, library. It could pass from one scholar to another. It would survive its author outside a printing workshop. Sheets of paper hang or lie waiting to dry. Inside, metal letters are arranged in reverse. Ink is rolled across them. A press descends, and line by line, an unsuccessful prosecution in an Alpine city begins to cast a much longer shadow. Heinrich Kramer had failed to secure the convictions he wanted in Innsbruck. His answer was to write the book that would become the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer. But before that book could claim authority, Kramer needed something more than his own certainty. He needed the reader to believe that the struggle against witchcraft had the support of the highest levels of the church. And for that, he had a document bearing the authority of a pope, the bull of Innocent the Eighth. Chapter 3, The Bull of Innocent V. E. Rome, December 1484. Winter has settled over the city, and inside the papal offices scribes work by window light and candle flame, copying documents whose authority may eventually reach hundreds of miles beyond the walls of Rome. On December 5th, Pope Innocent VIII issued one of the most famous papal texts associated with the history of European witchcraft. Its opening words were Summis desiderantes affectabis, often translated as desiring with supreme ardor. Later generations would call it the witch bull, and its reputation would become closely tied to the Malleus Maleficarum. But the connection between the two is often misunderstood. The bull was not written to approve the Malleus. The book had not yet appeared in its completed form, nor was it a command ordering Europe to begin hunting witches. What it did was confirm the authority of Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger to investigate certain offenses associated with witchcraft in parts of the German lands, where questions of jurisdiction had created obstacles to their work. Late medieval Europe was governed through overlapping layers of authority: bishops, town councils, territorial rulers, religious orders, imperial institutions, and local courts might all possess different rights and responsibilities. A papal appointment did not mean that every official would automatically accept an inquisitor's authority. According to the bull, some clergy and secular authorities had argued that Kramer and Sprenger lacked jurisdiction in particular dioceses over particular offenses, because earlier documents had not named those places and crimes with enough precision. Innocent VIII's response was to remove that ambiguity. Before the document named regions, including Mainz, Cologne, Trier, Salzburg, and Bremen, and authorized the inquisitors to preach, investigate, correct, imprison, and punish those found guilty of the offenses described. It also warned local authorities not to obstruct them. The accusations repeated in the bull reveal how several older traditions were being drawn together into a single image of the witch. It spoke of men and women who had allegedly abandoned the Catholic faith and entered into relations with demons. They were accused of using incantations, charms, conjurations, and other forbidden practices to damage crops, destroy vineyards, kill livestock, cause illness, prevent conception, interfere with marriage, and harm pregnancies. These ideas were not invented in 1484. Beliefs about harmful magic, demonic temptation, heresy, sexual disorder, and supernatural injury had developed over centuries. What mattered was that they now appeared together in a document carrying papal authority. For Kramer, this was enormously useful. It gave official weight to the kind of crimes he already believed were spreading through Christian society. Yet the bull did not guarantee Kramer's success. Less than a year later, in Innsbruck, he would discover the limits of written authority. The document allowed him to investigate, but it could not force every bishop, lawyer, magistrate, or local official to accept his methods. The Innsbruck proceedings still collapsed. The accused women were released. Bishop Georg Golse still opposed Kramer, and eventually told him to leave Tyrol. The bull strengthened Kramer's position, but it did not make him immune to criticism. This failure would shape what happened next. When Kramer began preparing the Malleus Maleficarum, he placed the papal bull near the beginning of the work. A reader opening the volume encountered Rome's authority before reaching much of Kramer's own argument. The effect was powerful, even though the chronology was clear. Innocent VIII had approved the Inquisitor's mission in 1484, not a book that had not yet been written. This distinction became blurred, because later readers often encountered the bull and the Malleus bound together. On the printed page, the separation between papal document and private treatise could appear, less obvious than it does to modern readers. Kramer understood the usefulness of respected authority, and the Pope would not be the only name attached to the book. Jacob Sprenger, a prominent Dominican theologian associated with Cologne, became known for centuries as Kramer's. His reputation brought additional weight to the text. Yet modern historians have raised serious doubts about whether Sprenger actually participated in writing the Malleus at all. Evidence of cooperation is weak, and there are signs that later regarded Kramer with hostility and attempted to limit his activity. Whatever role Sprenger may or may not have played, Kramer's voice and concerns dominate the work. The same desire for authority appears in the book's association with the University of Cologne. Approval from respected theologians would make a controversial text appear safer and more credible to judges, clergy, and educated readers. An approbation connected with Cologne was printed with the work, but its history is also disputed. Later scholarship has questioned how fully the university supported the book and whether Kramer represented that approval more broadly than the evidence justified. The pattern is revealing. Before the main argument had even begun, Kramer surrounded the Malleus with papal authority, academic authority, the prestige of another Dominican, and references to earlier theologians and legal writers. He did not ask the reader simply to trust Heinrich Kramer. He built a wall of respected names around his conclusions. That was important, because the questions he wanted to settle were still contested. Could witches truly cause storms, sickness, infertility, or death? Could demons interact physically with human beings? Were stories of supernatural travel real events, illusions, or lies? Could testimony normally treated with caution be accepted? In witchcraft cases, how should a judge investigate a crime that was supposedly secret, invisible, and committed with demonic assistance? Kramer approached these questions with little patience for skepticism. The first part of the Malleus would argue that witchcraft truly existed, and that denying its reality could itself become a religious error. Before describing witches, he first tried to remove the reader's permission to doubt them. If demons existed, if they could tempt human beings, and if people could freely choose evil, then cooperation between humans and demons was possible. From there, Kramer gathered scripture, theology, earlier demonological writings, legal arguments, and stories of alleged witchcraft into a system that made the crime appear both real and urgent. The structure of the Malleus followed naturally. First, establish that witchcraft exists. Second, explain what witches supposedly do and how their powers are believed to work. Third, explain how authorities should investigate, interrogate, try, and punish them. Kramer drew heavily from earlier writers, including Thomas Aquinas, Johann Schneider, and the Inquisitor Nicholas M. His originality was not that he invented every belief in the book, but that he organized existing ideas into a confident, practical framework. That confidence mattered. A judge facing rumor, illness, strange behavior, or unexplained death could open the book and find an explanation. A suspect's confession could confirm guilt. A denial could be treated as deception. A lack of ordinary evidence could be explained by the secrecy of the crime. Once every problem had an answer within the theory became difficult to escape. The printing press gave this system a reach earlier inquisitors had never possessed. In a workshop, metal letters were arranged into lines, inked, pressed onto paper, and repeated again and again. A papal bull, a theological argument, a legal instruction, or a frightening story could now travel from city to city in nearly identical form. The press did not judge the wisdom of what it reproduced. It simply multiplied it. And so the authority of Rome, the prestige of Cologne, the names of respected theologians, and Kramer's own certainty began to move together through printed pages. But de Malleus Maleficarum would not direct its suspicion equally. Although the papal bull spoke of offenders of both sexes, Kramer's book increasingly focused upon women. He connected witchcraft with older ideas about temptation, sexuality, weakness, reproduction, and sin. And he used those ideas to explain why women were, in his view, especially vulnerable to the devil. These passages would become among the most infamous in the entire work. To understand the Malleus, they cannot be treated as a side note. They are central to the kind of which Kramer imagined, the kind of accused person his readers were taught to suspect, and the reason the hammers so often fell in one direction. Chapter 4. Why the hammer fell on women. Some of the most disturbing passages in the Malleus Maleficarum are not those describing demons or curses, but those in which Heinrich Kramer attempts to explain why women were supposedly more likely than men to become witches. The papal bull associated with Kramer had spoken of offenders of both sexes, and men were certainly accused of witchcraft throughout Europe. Yet Kramer increasingly directed his attention toward women. He argued that they were more vulnerable to temptation, more easily deceived, more driven by emotion, and more susceptible to the influence of demons. These ideas did not originate with him. Medieval theology, classical philosophy, medicine, and popular culture already contained traditions that portrayed women as physically, intellectually, or morally weaker than men. Kramer gathered these older prejudices and reorganized them into a theory of witchcraft. One section of the Malleus asks directly why a greater number of witches were believed to be women. Kramer answers by describing women as more impressionable, more credulous, and less firm in faith. He repeatedly connects witchcraft with sexuality and identifies what he sees as three particularly dangerous female weaknesses: lack of faith, ambition, and lust. Of these, lust receives the greatest attention. In Kramer's thinking, the female body becomes a place of spiritual danger. Sexual desire, fertility, pregnancy, marriage, and childbirth are all drawn into his explanation of witchcraft. A witch is therefore not merely someone accused of casting spells. She becomes someone believed capable of threatening the religious and social order through both supernatural harm and control over reproduction. Kramer even attempted to support his argument through false etymology. He claimed that the Latin word femina, meaning woman, could be understood as suggesting weaker faith. The explanation was linguistically incorrect, but accuracy mattered less to him than the conclusion it appeared to support. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout the Malleus. Kramer begins with the belief that women are especially likely to become witches, then cites his scripture, theology, earlier writers, and anecdotal stories for evidence confirming that belief. His method rarely pauses to ask whether the original assumption might itself be wrong. The consequences of this reasoning become clearer when Kramer describes the crimes witches supposedly commit. Many involve reproduction. Witches are accused of causing infertility, preventing intercourse, causing miscarriages, harming pregnancies, killing infants, and interfering with marriage. Some passages even discuss the supposed disappearance of male sexual organs, which Kramer sometimes explains. Demonic illusion rather than literal physical removal. To a modern reader, these claims appear bizarre, but they connected witchcraft to fears that were very real in late medieval life. Childbirth was dangerous. Infant mortality was high. Illness could appear without explanation. A marriage might remain childless. In a world with limited medical knowledge, unexplained suffering created space for supernatural explanations. This was especially dangerous, because women were often closely connected to childbirth, infant care, healing, and household medicine. The Malleus contains particularly hostile passages about midwives, accusing some of killing infants or offering them to demons. This does not mean that medieval witch hunting was simply a campaign against midwives, as later popular accounts sometimes suggest. Most midwives were never accused of witchcraft. But Kramer's argument made childbirth another place where suspicion could develop. If a pregnancy failed, if an infant died, or if a birth went badly, tragedy could be transformed into accusation. In practice, witchcraft accusations usually began much closer to everyday life than to theological books. A quarrel between neighbors might be remembered after livestock became sick. A request for food might be refused, followed by an angry remark, and later by some unrelated misfortune. A healer might be blamed when a remedy failed. A woman already known for disputes might acquire a reputation for causing harm. One story could join another, until coincidence appeared to form a pattern. By the time rumors reached an investigator, separate events could sound like evidence of a hidden crime. Kramer's system gave these local suspicions a larger meaning. A woman accused of harming a cow was no longer merely a hostile neighbor. If harmful magic existed, Kramer believed demons must have helped perform it. If demons were involved, then some form of agreement with the devil could be assumed. A local argument could therefore become maleficium, harmful magic. Harmful magic could become demonic cooperation. Demonic cooperation could become rejection of the Christian faith. What began as a village dispute could be transformed into a crime against the entire religious order. The female which described in the Malleus was therefore built from several fears at once. She was supposedly dangerous to religion because she served demons, dangerous to neighbors because she could harm invisibly, dangerous to marriage because she could interfere with sexuality, and dangerous to family life because she could supposedly prevent birth or harm children. Yet Europe was never uniform in its accusations. Men were also prosecuted for witchcraft, and in some regions they formed a substantial portion of the accused. Local law, religion, custom, and social conflict all shaped who became a target. The Malleus Maleficarum did not create every stereotype associated with witches, nor did every later judge follow Kramer, but it gave unusually direct intellectual support to the idea that women deserved particular suspicion. During the centuries that followed, when witch prosecutions became far more intense in many parts of Europe, women would form the majority of those accused in many regions. Kramer's book did not cause that pattern by itself, but it helped organize and amplify beliefs that were already present. By this point in the Malleus, the argument has moved from theology into ordinary life. Witchcraft is no longer something distant. It appears in marriage, pregnancy, livestock, illness, food, neighbors, and children. Kramer has told the reader that witches exist. He has told the reader why women should supposedly be watched more carefully. The next question is what these witches were believed capable of doing. And here the book enters some of its strangest territory: storms, curses, illness, infertility, dead animals, demonic encounters, bodies altered by illusion, harm carried out without visible weapons. For Kramer, these were not merely stories, they were crimes. Chapter 5. What witches were believed to do. Whence Heinrich Kramer had argued that witches existed and that women were supposedly especially vulnerable to becoming them. The Malleus Maleficarum turned toward a more practical question. What could a witch actually do? The answers filled the book with stories of damaged crops, sick animals, failed pregnancies, sexual dysfunction, storms, mysterious illnesses, and encounters with demons. Kramer did not treat these as folklore toad around village fires. He presented them as real offenses requiring explanation and prosecution. At the center of many of these accusations was the idea of maleficium harm, caused through magic. A person might suddenly become ill after an argument. A cow might stop producing milk. Crops might fail after an unexpected storm. A marriage might remain childless. Two Kramer events such as these could sometimes be evidence that a witch had acted with demonic assistance. Weather was among the powers most often attributed to witch. Storms could destroy months of work within minutes, flattening grain, damaging vineyards, flooding fields, or killing livestock. In communities dependent upon agriculture, a violent hailstorm was not simply inconvenient. It could threaten food, supplies, and income for an entire year. The Malleus repeated stories in which witches supposedly raised storms by throwing substances into water, performing rituals, or calling upon demons. Kramer believed that demons possessed enough knowledge of the natural world to manipulate winds, clouds, and moisture, but that they acted through witches who had entered into agreements with them. In this way, a natural disaster could be given a human cause. Instead of an unpredictable storm, there could now be someone to blame. The same reasoning was applied to animals and crops. Witches were accused of causing cattle to become sick, preventing cows from producing milk, killing horses, ruining grain, and damaging fruit or vineyards. These accusations often grew from ordinary tensions between neighbors. Imagine two households arguing over a boundary, a debt, or an insult. Days later, an animal falls ill. Someone remembers angry words spoken during the dispute. If the suspected person or ice carried a reputation for magic, the connection could seem obvious to those who believed such powers existed. Kramer collected stories of this kind as evidence. He rarely approached them as coincidences that might have grown through repetition. Instead, each new story strengthened the world his book was constructing. Human illness could be interpreted in the same way. Medieval medicine possessed sophisticated traditions of its own, but many diseases remained difficult to diagnose or treat. Sudden paralysis, seizures, unexplained pain, infertility, or changes in behavior could appear mysterious, even to experienced physicians. The Malleus allowed witchcraft to exist beside natural explanations. Kramer did not argue that every illness came from magic, but he insisted that some could. This created an enormous problem for anyone accused. If doctors could not identify a clear natural cause, supernatural interference remained available as an explanation. The absence of an ordinary answer did not weaken the accusations. It could make the accusations stronger. Reproduction received even greater attention. Kramer claimed that witches could prevent intercourse, cause infertility, produce miscarriages, harm unborn children, and kill infants. These fears brought witchcraft into the most private areas of household life. A couple unable to conceive might wonder whether someone had interfered with them. A pregnancy ending unexpectedly could generate suspicion. An infant dying without an obvious explanation could leave grieving relatives searching for a cause. Kramer offered one. He described witches supposedly using charms, objects, or demonic assistance to interfere with the reproductive body. The claims were impossible to verify in the way modern evidence required, but within his system they formed part of a larger pattern. Some of the strangest passages concern Maya, sexual organs that witches were said to make disappear. Kramer did not always claim that the organ was physically removed. Instead, he sometimes explained the effect as an illusion produced by demons, preventing a man from seeing or feeling what remained present. The distinction reveals something important about Malleus. Kramer did not believe demons could perform absolutely anything. Christian theology placed limits upon their power. Demons could manipulate perception, move physical objects, influence the body, and exploit natural forces. But they could not create true miracles in the same way as God. When stories seemed to involve impossible transformations, Kramer often used illusion to preserve both the story and the theology behind it. This also applied to claims that witches could transform human beings into animals. Stories of people appearing as wolves, cats, or other creatures circulated long before the Malleus. Kramer generally avoided saying that a human body literally became an animal. Instead, a demon might deceive the senses of observers or create an appearance that made transformation seem real. The victim of the illusion could believe something impossible had happened. According to the theological explanation, the underlying human body remained unchanged. This allowed Kramer to accept extraordinary testimony without granting witches unlimited supernatural power. Flight presented another problem. Stories of women traveling through the night, sometimes over great distances, had existed for centuries. Earlier church authorities had sometimes treated such claims as dreams or demonic illusions. Kramer was far more willing to accept that witches could actually be transported from place to place through demonic assistance. The question mattered because stories of nighttime travel eventually became connected with the imagined witch gathering, later commonly called the Sabbath. If witches could physically travel, then secret meetings could be treated not merely as dreams, but as events that investigators might attempt to uncover. Behind nearly all these powers stood the same essential figure, the demon. Kramer did not believe witches possessed independent supernatural abilities. Their supposed power came from cooperation with evil spirits. A charm by itself was not the real danger. The deeper crime was the relationship behind it. This is what transformed witchcraft from harmful folk magic into something much more serious within the logic of the Malleus. A person accused of causing illness through magic could also be accused of having entered into a relationship with the devil. The physical harm became evidence of spiritual betrayal. This framework made almost any form of misfortune potentially meaningful. A storm could be natural, but it might also be witchcraft. An illness could be natural, but it might also be witchcraft. Infertility could have ordinary causes, but witchcraft remained possible. The more flexible the theory became, the more difficult it was to disprove. If an accused person denied performing magic, the denial did not necessarily end the matter. If witnesses disagreed, investigators could continue questioning them. If there was no visible evidence, secrecy itself explained why evidence was difficult. To find Dot in a village at night, little would appear unusual. Animals settle inside barns. Fires burn low behind shuttered windows. Wind moves through the fields. Somewhere a child coughs. Somewhere else a family watches over a sick animal. By morning, most of these small events pass without consequence. But in a community where witchcraft is already suspected, one event can attach itself to an old argument, an old rumor, or an unpopular neighbor. De Malleus Maleficarum taught its readers how to connect those events into a single explanation. Kramer's witches could damage the body, the household, the harvest, and the community. Yet these acts were still only the visible part of the crime. The deepest offense, in his view, occurred before the storm, before the illness, and before the curse. It began when the witch supposedly rejected the Christian faith and entered into an agreement with the devil. And so the hammer moved from what witches were believed to do toward the question that made all of those acts possible: the pact. Chapter 6. The Pact with the Devil. At the center of Heinrich Kramer's understanding of witchcraft was an idea far more serious than the casting of a curse. A witch, he believed, did not simply possess forbidden knowledge. The witch had entered into a relationship with demons and, ultimately, with the devil himself. This supposed agreement transformed witchcraft from harmful magic into a form of religious betrayal. A failed harvest might damage a village. A mysterious illness might harm a family. But a pact with the devil represented something larger: the deliberate rejection of Christianity and the acceptance of an enemy faith. This idea had developed gradually during the later Middle Ages. Earlier accusations of magic did not always require a satanic pact. A person might be suspected of using charms, attempting divination, consulting spirits, or performing rituals condemned by the Church without being imagined as a member of an organized conspiracy against Christianity. By the 15th century, however, demonologists increasingly connected harmful magic with heresy. If supernatural power did not come from God, they reasoned, then demons must somehow be involved. And if demons were involved, the person seeking their assistance must have cooperated with them. The pact supplied the missing link in the Malleus Maleficarum. Kramer described this relationship as something entered willingly. The accused, which was not merely tricked for a moment by an evil spirit. She supposedly surrendered herself to demonic service, rejected elements of the Christian faith, and agreed to perform acts commanded by the devil. Some accounts described the renunciation of baptism, the rejection of Christ, or the promise of loyalty to a demon. These stories varied from one author and regent to another, but the underlying idea remained similar. Witchcraft was not simply what the accused person did. It was whom the accused was believed to serve. That belief changed the meaning of ordinary accusations. If a woman was blamed for making a neighbor sick, the physical illness was only the beginning. An investigator influenced by demonological theory could ask how she had acquired the power. If the answer was demonic assistance, then another question. Prologue. Why would a demon help her? The theory answered itself. There must have been an agreement. The agreement might never have been witnessed. No written contract was required. Its existence could be inferred from the supposed magical act itself. This made the accusation extremely difficult to escape. The pact was invisible by nature. It supposedly occurred in secret, often with only demons and the accused present. The absence of witnesses therefore did not disprove it. Instead, secrecy became part of the expected behavior. Once investigators accepted the underlying theory, they could interpret a confession as proof while treating denial as concealment. The alleged crime had been designed intellectually to exist beyond ordinary observation. Kramer also described demons appearing in physical form. Medieval theology generally held that demons were spiritual beings and did not possess human bodies of their own. But writers explained that they could manipulate matter or create temporary appearances. This allowed demonologists to accept stories in which demons seemed to speak, touch, eat, travel, or engage physically with humans, while still maintaining theological distinctions between human and spiritual beings. Sexual contact occupied an especially prominent place in these theories. Medieval theologians had long discussed the ideas of the incubus and succubus, demons believed to assume male or female forms for sexual encounters with human beings. Kramer incorporated these traditions heavily into his explanation of witchcraft. For him, sexuality was not a separate subject from demonic influence. It was one of the principal ways in which he imagined the devil corrupting human behavior. His earlier claims about women, lust, fertility, and reproduction all converged here. The descriptions could become elaborate. A demon might supposedly approach someone during weakness or desperation. It might offer assistance, revenge, knowledge, or protection. The accused person would then agree to its demands. Plated demonological writings would develop these stories into increasingly detailed ceremonies of initiation. But the Malleus already contained the basic structure: temptation, agreement, rejection of faith, and harmful acts performed through demonic assistance. Such stories also gave investigators an explanation for how an ordinary person could supposedly perform impossible things. The witch herself did not need to command the weather or possess the natural ability to cause disease from a distance. The demons supplied the power. This preserved the hierarchy of Kramer's universe. God remained supreme. Demons possessed limited abilities derived from their nature and their knowledge of the physical world. Human witches remained human. Their danger came from their willingness to cooperate with beings more powerful than themselves. Even demonic power, however, was not unlimited. Kramer worked within a Christian theology that insisted nothing could occur outside divine permission. This produced an uncomfortable question. If witches and demons caused suffering, why would God allow it? Demonologists answered by presenting such events as permitted temporarily for reasons beyond human understanding: punishment, testing, or the consequences of sin. The devil could act, but only within boundaries ultimately allowed by God. Witchcraft, therefore, existed inside the same religious system that condemned it. For the accused, these theological distinctions offered little protection. The pact transformed accusations of village magic into accusations of apostasy. A charm used to heal, harm, protect livestock, or influence affection might now be interpreted as evidence of demonic cooperations. A practice that had once been treated as superstition could become proof of a much more serious crime if investigators believed a demon stood behind it. The idea also encouraged investigators to search for networks. If one person had been recruited by the devil, perhaps others had been recruited as well. If demons encouraged witches to spread their practices, then the accused might know additional witches. One confession could therefore produce names. Those names could produce new interrogations, and new interrogations could produce additional accusations. The imagined pact helped turn witchcraft from an individual offense into the possibility of conspiracy. This would become increasingly important in later witch trials, where authorities sometimes came to believe they were uncovering organized communities of witches, rather than isolated offenders. The stories began to include meetings, rituals, feasts, dancing, demonic ceremonies, and collective worship of the devil. The image of the witch's Sabbath would eventually become one of the most recognizable elements of European witchcraft belief. But in everyday life, none of this needed to be visible. A village could appear completely ordinary. Bells rang in the morning. Fields were worked. Bread was baked. Animals were fed. People attended church and returned home. The imagined conspiracy existed beneath that familiar surface, hidden precisely because its members supposedly knew enough to conceal themselves. This hidden quality made the theory powerful. Every ordinary neighbor could remain ordinary, or could be something else. The witch was frightening, not because she looked supernatural, but because she might look familiar. Kramer's world therefore required methods capable of uncovering what could not be seen. Questions had to be asked. Witnesses had to be examined. Contradictions had to be interpreted. Confessions had to be obtained. And once authorities believed they were investigating a secret alliance with the devil. Ordinary legal caution could begin to look like dangerous hesitation. The Malleus Maleficarum was moving toward its most practical purpose, not simply explaining witches, but teaching authorities how to find them. Before Kramer reached the courtroom. But however, one more idea had to be explored. The possibility that witches did not act alone. They gathered, they traveled, they met beyond the sight of ordinary people, and in later imagination, those secret meetings would become known by one enduring name. The Witches' Sabbath. Chapter 7, The Witches' Sabbath. By the late Middle Ages, the imagined witch was becoming something more than an isolated person accused of causing harm. Demonologists increasingly described witches as members of a hidden community, connected through shared beliefs, secret meetings, and service to the devil. This idea would eventually produce one of the most enduring images in European witchcraft, the witches' Sabbath. Yet the fully developed Sabbath familiar from later trials and artwork did not appear all at once, and the Malleus Maleficarum did not contain every feature that later writers would attach to it. Instead, Kramer stood at an important stage in the ideas development, when older stories of nighttime travel, heretical gatherings, demonic worship, and magical conspiracy were beginning to merge. For centuries, church writers had known stories of women who claimed to travel through the night with supernatural beings. One influential medieval text, later known through the canon Episcopi, treated such experiences with skepticism. It described women who believed they rode at night with the pagan figure Diana or other mysterious female beings, but insisted that these journeys occurred through illusion and deception rather than physical travel. The devil, according to this older interpretation, could deceive the mind into believing that something extraordinary had happened, while a person's body remained where it was. Kramer was far less comfortable with that explanation. While he accepted that demons could create illusions, he also argued that witches might truly be transported from one place to another through demonic assistance. The difference was crucial. If nighttime journeys could actually occur, then meetings between witches could also be real events rather than dreams. Stories of secret gatherings had already appeared in 5th-10th century writings before the Malleus. Authors such as Johann Schneider described alleged groups of witches who renounced Christianity, performed harmful magic, and passed forbidden practices from one person to another. These accounts borrowed imagery from older descriptions of heretics, who had often been accused of meeting secretly at night, rejecting Christian rites, and participating in immoral ceremonies. Over time, the language of heresy and the language of witchcraft began to overlap. The witch was no longer simply someone who cursed a neighbor. She could be imagined as a member of an organized anti-Christian community. Kramer accepted the possibility that witches gathered and that demons helped bring them together. Flight could be accomplished, he believed, through the devil's power. Stories told of witches applying substances to objects or themselves before being carried through the air, sometimes over remarkable distances. Kramer attempted to fit such report into theology by insisting that demons, although unable to perform true miracles, could move physical bodies. A demon might therefore lift a person and transport them rapidly from one location to another. As with so many extraordinary claims in the Malleus, theology did not restrain the story, so much as provide a mechanism for accepting it. What supposedly happened at these gatherings varied greatly between accounts. Later descriptions would include enormous nighttime assemblies, feasting, dancing, sexual activity, the desecration of Christian symbols, the appearance of the devil in animal or human form, and formal ceremonies in which new witches pledged themselves to him. Some trials produced elaborate accounts of entire communities traveling to such meetings. But historians must treat these confessions carefully. Many emerged during interrogations in which suspects were repeatedly questioned, pressured, or tortured, often by officials who already possessed ideas about what a gathering should look like. The more authorities expected to hear about secret meetings, the more their questions could help produce stories matching those expectations. The Malleus contributed put to the larger theory by insisting that witchcraft could spread from person to person. A demon might recruit an individual, but witches themselves could also introduce others to the practice. Kramer described forms of initiation in which new recruits supposedly rejected the faith and entered into demonic service. This turned witchcraft into a contagious threat. An accused person might no longer be investigated only for what she had allegedly done. Authorities could ask who had taught her, who had accompanied her, and whom she had recruited. A single accusation could therefore expand outward. One name produced another. One confession could open several investigations. The belief in gatherings created the possibility that an entire network might be hiding inside an otherwise ordinary commune. This idea was particularly dangerous because secret conspiracy explains its own lack of evidence. If authorities found no public rituals, that was expected. The meetings were secret. If respectable neighbors had never witnessed them, that too made sense. The witches supposedly gathered at night or far from ordinary observation. If the accused, denial attending. The denial could be interpreted as an attempt to protect accomplices. Once the theory was accepted, almost every absence of evidence could be absorbed into it. The imagined Sabbath existed beyond ordinary sight, and that invisibility helped make it difficult to disprove. Picture a town after dark. The gates are closed. Most windows have gone black. A few hearths still glow. Beyond the houses, roads disappear into fields and woodland. Nothing visible separates this night from hundreds of others. Yet in the demonological imagination, the quiet landscape conceals movement. Somewhere beyond the town, witches are believed to be gathering. They travel unseen, meet with demons, renew their promises, share knowledge, and return before morning. The fear comes not from what anyone can actually observe, but from what authorities have been taught might exist beyond observation. During the 16th and 17th centuries, the witches' Sabbath would become more elaborate and more familiar. Parties depicted groups flying through the air or gathering around monstrous figures. Demonologists argued over the details. Trial records accumulated descriptions of nighttime assemblies. Yet these images should not be mistaken for direct records. Poof. of a real underground religion practiced across Europe. They reveal far more about what interrogators, theologians, artists, and frightened communities expected witches to do than they do about the existence of organized satanic gatherings. For Heinrich Kramer, however, the possibility of such gatherings helped solve another problem. Witchcraft was no longer random. It possessed a method of expansion. The devil recruited witches. Witches recruited others. They met, shared practices, and returned to their communities where they supposedly caused harm. The scattered accusations of illness, failed crops, infertility, and curses could now be imagined as pieces of a larger hidden system, and once authorities believed they were facing an organized enemy. Finding that enemy became more urgent. The final portion of the Malleus Maleficarum moved increasingly toward procedure. How should accusations begin? Which witnesses could be believed? What should happen when a suspect denied everything? When could imprisonment be used? When could torture enter the process? How could a judge pursue a crime that supposedly left so little visible evidence? This was where theology became machinery. The hammer was about to enter the courtroom. Chapter 8. Hunting the Invisible. Crime, the final part of the Malleus. Maleficarum turns away from broad questions about demons and witchcraft and towards something far more practical. What should authorities actually do when someone is accused? For Heinrich Kramer, this was the problem that had followed him since Innsbruck. Witchcraft was supposedly committed in secret, often without ordinary witnesses, and the people accused of it could simply deny everything. A judge, therefore, needed procedures capable of uncovering a crime that, according to the theory itself, had been designed to remain hidden. The result was a legal framework in which suspicion, reputation, testimony, interrogation, and confession could become more important than physical evidence. Kramer did not invent the legal system he described. He drew from existing inquisitorial and criminal procedures, earlier legal writers, and practices already used in cases involving heresy and serious crime. But the Malleus adapted those tools to witchcraft. Proceedings could begin through formal accusation, denunciation, or public rumor. A community reputation could matter. If several people independently described similar suspicions, authorities might consider the case worth pursuing. The problem, of course, was that rumor could reproduce itself. A person already whispered about as a witch was more likely to be blamed when something went wrong, and each new accusation could strengthen the reputation that had helped produce it. Witnessed testimony, therefore, occupied a central place in Kramer's system. He recognized that witchcraft was supposedly difficult to observe directly, so he was willing to accept forms of testimony that might be treated more cautiously in other cases. People with personal hostility toward the accused could sometimes still provide information, depending upon the circumstances. Kramer also discussed situations involving witnesses whose legal status might otherwise reduce their credibility. His concern was practical. If the rules of evidence were too restrictive, he feared that witches would simply escape punishment because their crimes were secret. The more exceptional the crime appeared, the easier it became to justify exceptional methods for proving it. Once suspicion was strong enough, the accused could be arrested and questioned. The interrogation was not imagined as a neutral search, beginning from complete uncertainty. By the time a suspect reached this stage, authorities might already possess statements from neighbors describing quarrels, threats, illnesses, dead animals, failed crops, or other misfortunes. The interrogator could ask about these incidents, one after another. Had she argued with this person? Had she visited that house? Why had a cow become sick after she left? Why had a child fallen ill? Had she ever used charms? Had anyone taught her forbidden practices? The separate events of an ordinary life could gradually be reorganized into the outline of a crime. The accused might never be told everything that had been said against her at the beginning of the process. Kramer was concerned that revealing names to Fraley could expose witnesses to retaliation or magical revenge. At the same time, the accused was expected to identify enemies who might have testified out of hatred. This created an obvious difficulty. How could someone name the hostile witness without knowing who the witnesses were? In practice, procedures differed greatly between jurisdictions, and the Malleus was never a universal law code. But Kramer's proposed system consistently favored the investigation of witchcraft over broad protections for the accused. Physical examination could also become part of the process. Authorities sometimes searched suspects for objects, charms, or hidden items, believed to provide magical protection. Later witch trials in various regions would develop more elaborate practices, involving supposed witches' marks or insensitive spots on the body. Though many of these became more prominent after Kramer's time, the underlying idea was already familiar. If a witch had entered into service with demons, perhaps the body or possessions would reveal something the suspect refused to confess. Yet, the most valuable evidence remained confession. A confession did more than establish guilt. It could confer the entire theory behind the prosecution. The accused might be encouraged to describe how witchcraft had begun, which demon had appeared, what promises had been made, what harm had been performed, and whether other witches were involved. Each detail could transform an invisible crime into a narrative that appeared complete. More dangerously, the names of supposed accomplices could create new cases. A confession was, therefore, capable of expanding an investigation far beyond the original accusation. But what if the suspect refused to confess? This was where coercion entered the system. Late medieval law permitted torture in certain serious criminal investigations under defined circumstances, though rules varied enormously from place to place. Kramer treated witchcraft as serious enough to justify its use when sufficient indications of guilt existed. Torture was not supposed to replace evidence entirely. In theory, authorities first required a level of suspicion strong enough to justify further questioning. In practice, however, the boundary between investigation and assumed guilt could become dangerously thin. Kramer advised judges to proceed carefully, but his definition of careful procedure existed inside a system that already assumed witchcraft was real. The suspect could be shown instruments of torture before they were used. She could be urged to confess voluntarily. If she continued to deny the accusation, interrogation could intensify. The stated purpose was to uncover truth, but the pressure upon the accused was obvious. A person in pain quickly learned that denial prolonged suffering, while the answer expected by the interrogator might end it. Even the legal language surrounding torture could become flexible. Medieval and early modern legal systems sometimes imposed restrictions on repeating torture. Authorities developed ways of interpreting continued interrogation as a continuation of an earlier session rather than a completely new one. Such distinctions reveal the dangerous tension inside the process. The law attempted to place limits around coercion, while investigators who believed they were confronting a secret demonic conspiracy searched for ways to overcome resistance. Kramer also understood that confession obtained under torture could be legally problematic. In many legal traditions, a confession made while torture was actively occurring required later confirmation when the suspect was no longer under immediate physical pressure. On paper, this might appear to provide protection, but a prisoner who knew that withdrawal of the confession could lead back to the torture chamber was hardly speaking under ordinary conditions. The room itself would have been simple: stone or plaster walls, a table, candles or daylight from a narrow window, clerks waiting to record answers, officials speaking questions already shaped by what witnesses had told them. The accused stood or sat before people who possessed the power to imprison, interrogate, and eventually condemn. Nothing supernatural needed to happen inside that room. The entire machinery depended upon human decisions, and those decisions could begin from assumptions, supplied by books like the Malleus Maleficarum. If the judge believed witches existed, then accusation deserved investigation. If witchcraft was secret, lack of direct evidence was understandable. If demons helped witches conceal their crimes, denial was expected. If confession was necessary to reveal the hidden truth, pressure could be justified. Each step followed logically from the one before it. The danger was not that medieval courts had no rules. The danger was that rules could operate inside a false premise. A carefully documented procedure could still produce a false conclusion if everyone involved had already accepted the existence of a crime that could not be independently demonstrated. The clerk might record every answer accurately. The judge might follow the accepted stages of investigation. Witnesses might sincerely believe what they reported, and an innocent person could still reach the end of the process with a confession describing events that had never occurred. This is one of the most important things to understand about the European witch trials. They did not require everyone involved to be dishonest. Fear could be sincere. Belief could be sincere. Testimony could be sincere, and the resulting conviction could still be wrong. The Malleus Maleficarum offered judges a method for turning invisible suspicion into visible procedure. But the most powerful instrument in that procedure was not a book, a witness, or even a courtroom. It was confession. And when confession would not come willingly, authorities possessed another method for obtaining it. The next chapter of the Hammer breathes into the place where belief, law, fear, and physical suffering met most directly. The torture chamber. Chapter 9: Torture, Confession, and the Search for Proof for Heinrich Kramer. Confession occupied a special place in the investigation of witchcraft. A confession could transform suspicion into certainty, at least in the eyes of the court. It could explain how the accused supposedly became a witch, what harm had been done, which demons had assisted, and whether other people were involved. But a problem remained. If witches were truly servants of the devil, Kramer believed, they would not confess easily. They might deny everything, resist interrogation, or claim innocence, even when witnesses had accused them. In that situation, the legal system already possessed one of the most feared instruments of medieval and early modern justice: judicial torture. Torture was not created for witch trials, and it was not used everywhere in the same way. It had long been permitted under certain legal systems for serious crimes when authorities believed enough evidence already existed to justify further interrogation. In theory, torture was controlled by rules. A judge was not simply supposed to seize someone and inflict pain until a desired answer appeared. There had to be sufficient indications of guilt, and any confession produced under torture might later need to be repeated outside the immediate pressure of the interrogation. These safeguards sounded meaningful on paper. In practice, however, they could fail badly when applied to a crime that authorities already believed was secret, supernatural, and difficult to prove by ordinary means. The logic of witchcraft made coercion especially dangerous. If the accused denied everything, the denial could be interpreted as stubborn resistance. If she remained silent, that too could appear suspicious. If she endured pain without confessing, some investigators might believe the devil was giving her supernatural strength. The very act of resisting could therefore become part of the evidence against her. The theory was capable of absorbing almost any response. Confession confirmed guilt. Denial could suggest concealment. Endurance could suggest demonic protection. There was no easy answer that guaranteed escape. Before torture began, a prisoner might simply be shown the instruments. The intention was obvious. The sight of ropes, restraints, pulleys, or other devices could be enough to produce fear before any physical pain was inflicted. Authorities might urge the accused to confess voluntarily and spare herself what was coming. In some jurisdictions, this threat formed a formal stage of interrogation. The prisoner understood that the next stage could be worse. The techniques themselves varied by region and period. One common method involved binding the arms and suspending the prisoner with a rope, sometimes adding weights to increase the strain. Other courts used devices that compressed limbs or stretched the body. The popular image of every witch trial involving elaborate machines belongs partly to later legend, but the reality did not require theatrical equipment. Rope, weight, restraint, cold, exhaustion, isolation, and repeated questioning were enough to inflict severe suffering. The purpose was officially to uncover truth. But torture creates a fundamental problem that officials of the period never fully solved. People under extreme pain will often say whatever they believe will make the pain stop. If interrogators already possessed a detailed theory of witchcraft, they could unintentionally provide the structure of the confession themselves. Questions could contain the expected answers. Did a demon appear? What did it look like? Who was present at the gathering? Who taught you the spell? Which neighbors attended with you? A frightened prisoner did not need prior knowledge of witchcraft theology to begin producing a story. The interrogation could teach her what the court expected to hear. This was one reason. which confessions sometimes became more elaborate as investigations continued. A first statement might contain only a simple admission of harmful magic. Later, questioning could produce demons, nighttime travel, secret meetings, sexual encounters, renunciation of Christianity, and the names of supposed Each answer opened another question. Each new detail made the story appear more complete. And because the confession now matched what demonological writers had already described, officials could interpret that similarity as proof that the theory was correct. The cycle could then spread beyond one person. If the accused named someone else, that person could be arrested and questioned. Under pressure, the second prisoner might name several more. Those names produced additional investigations. In some of the largest witch panics of later centuries, accusations expanded in precisely this way. The belief that witches formed secret networks made every confession potentially dangerous to an entire community. The Malleus Maleficarum attempted to guide judges through this process while preserving an appearance of lawful procedure. Kramer discussed when torture might be used, how questioning should proceed, and how confessions should be handled afterward. He was not telling judges to ignore the law. The deeper problem was that his legal advice operated within an assumption that witches truly existed and could conceal themselves through demonic assistance. Once that assumption was accepted, protections that might otherwise limit coercion could begin to look like obstacles preventing the discovery of truth. Even the required that a confession be confirmed after torture offered less protection than it appeared. A prisoner removed from immediate pain still knew what could happen if the confession was withdrawn. The torture chamber did not need to be physically present to remain powerful. Memory was enough. A person who had already experienced the rope, de-restraint, or the fear of another session might repeat whatever the court wished to hear simply to avoid returning. There was also the problem of repetition. Legal tradition sometimes discouraged or restricted repeated torture, but courts could find ways around such limits by describing a later session as a continuation of an earlier one rather than a new act. The language changed. The suffering did not. This distinction shows how procedure could become flexible when authorities believed the crime before them was exceptionally difficult to uncover. Inside the interrogation room, the scene remained entirely human. A clerk recorded words. A judge asked questions. Assistants handled restraints. The prisoner answered or remained silent. No demon appeared. No supernatural event was required. Yet everyone involved might believe they were confronting something supernatural. That belief shaped every decision made inside the room. This is what made confession so powerful in witch trials. It appeared to provide direct evidence of an invisible world. A woman might describe meeting a demon flying through the night, harming a native's livestock, or attending a secret gathering. Her own words then seemed to confirm everything theologians had written. But if those words had been produced through fear, suggestion, exhaustion, or pain, the confession did not prove that the events had occurred. It proved only that the prisoner had finally said them. Still, once written into the court record, those words acquired permanence. The clerk's ink preserved them. Other officials could read them. Future investigators could compare them with other confessions. Demonologists could cite them as evidence. A story produced in one interrogation chamber could travel into another trial years later, where new prisoners were questioned about the same details. The process created a strange feedback loop. Books such as the Malleus shaped the questions investigators asked. The answers produced during interrogations then appeared to confirm the books. Those confessions could later be used by writers as further proof that witches behaved exactly as demonology claimed. Belief created the interrogation. The interrogation produced the confession. The confession strengthened the belief. And yet torture alone cannot explain the European witch hunts. Many trials occurred without it. Some courts restricted its use severely. Others rejected cases for lack of evidence. Some regions experienced few prosecutions at all. Witch hunting was never a single uniform system spreading evenly across Europe. Local law, politics, religion, judges, community conflicts, and social conditions all mattered. But where torture combined with strong belief in a hidden conspiracy, the results could be devastating. One accusation might become 10, 10 might become 50, and the same questions would be asked again and again. Who taught you? Who met with you? Who else serves the devil? The search for proof could become the mechanism that created the proof. By the time the confession was written down, the court might believe it had finally uncovered the hidden world described by the Malleus Maleficarum. The next question was what to do with the person who had confessed. For some, the answer meant penance or imprisonment. For others, it meant something final: judgment, sentence, and death. Chapter 10's Judgment. The stake and the legacy of the Harmaway witchcraft trial did not always end in execution. Some accusations were dismissed. Some suspects were released. Others received religious penance, fines, imprisonment, or lesser punishments. Courts differed from one territory to another, and no single legal system governed all of Europe. But when an accused person was convicted of serious witchcraft and heresy, the final judgment could lead to death. In many continental territories, the death was associated with fire. That condemned might be handed over to secular authorities, because ecclesiastical courts did not ordinarily carry out executions themselves. Elsewhere, different methods were used. Hanging became more common in England, and later in the English colonies. The image of every accused which being burned at the stake is therefore too simple. But fire became one of the most powerful symbols of the persecutions that followed. For Heinrich Kramer, punishment was the final stage of a much larger process. Witchcraft was dangerous, not only because someone had supposedly caused illness, destroyed crops, or harmed a child. In the world described by the Malleus Maleficarum, the witch had entered into rebellion against Christianity itself. The crime combined harmful magic with heresy, apostasy, and demonic allegiance. Once an accused person was understood in those terms, severe punishment could be presented as the defense of both the community and the faith. The same logic that began with a sick cow or a neighbor's accusation could end with a legal sentence, carrying the authority of the court. The journey from suspicion to execution might begin with something remarkably ordinary: a quarrel, an illness, a failed harvest, a child who did not recover. Someone remembers a threat. Another remembers an older rumor. Witnesses speak. Officials begin asking questions. The accused denies everything. The denial creates more suspicion. Interrogation follows. Perhaps torture. Eventually, a confession is written into the record. Names are given. Other people are questioned. What began as one unexplained event can expand into an entire hidden world of demons, secret meetings, curses, and conspiracies. The Malleus Maleficarum offered a framework capable of holding all these pieces together. It told the reader that witchcraft was real. It explained why demons could supposedly assist human beings. It argued that women were especially vulnerable. It described the harm witches were believed capable of causing. It explained the supposed pact with the devil and the possibility of secret gatherings. Finally, it offered procedures for investigation, interrogation, and judgment. This completeness helped make the book memorable. Kramer did not simply warn that witches existed. He attempted to provide an entire system for understanding them. Yet the Malleus was never the universal rule-book of European witch-hunting. It was not an official law code imposed upon every Catholic court. It was not accepted everywhere, and it did not create the European witch hunts by itself. Some authorities rejected Kramer's methods. Some theologians disagreed with him. Some courts demanded stronger evidence than others. Entire regions experienced relatively little witch persecution, while others suffered devastating waves of trial. The greatest persecutions would occur mainly during the 16th and 17th century, decades after the first publication of the Hammer. What the printing press gave Kramer was reach. The book appeared in repeated editions and circulated among educated readers. Other demonologists wrote their own works. Judges, clergy, lawyers, scholars, and political authorities continued debating what witchcraft was and how it should be prosecuted. As these ideas circulated, the imagined witch became increasingly familiar. A person who had rejected God, made an agreement with the devil, gathered with others in secret, and used demonic power to harm the innocent. Over the following centuries, tens of thousands of people would be executed for witchcraft across Europe and its colonies. Most of those accused in many regions were women, though men were also prosecuted in significant numbers. The intensity of the hunts varied dramatically. Dumini and parts of the Holy Roman Empire experienced some of the largest persecutions. Scotland suffered severe episodes. France, Switzerland, Scandinavia, and other regions developed their own patterns. In England, trials followed different legal traditions, and across the Atlantic, the accusations at Salem would become some of the most famous witchcraft proceedings in history. But the persecutions did not continue forever. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, skepticism grew among judges, scholars, physicians, clergy, and governments. Standards of evidence became more restrictive in many places. Courts grew increasingly reluctant to accept stories, tell of supernatural crimes that could not be independently demonstrated. Confessions produced through torture were viewed with greater suspicion. The same kinds of extraordinary claims that once seemed to reveal a hidden conspiracy increasingly appeared unreliable. The change was gradual. There was no single moment when Europe simply stopped believing in witchcraft. Popular traditions survived long after formal prosecutions declined. People continued using charms, consulting healers, fearing curses, and telling stories about witches. But the machinery of state prosecution weakened. Governments became less willing to execute people for invisible crime. Courts began demanding forms of proof that witchcraft accusations could rarely provide. And slowly, the hammer lost its power. Heinrich Kramer died in the early 16th century. He did not live to see the largest witch hunts that followed, nor could he have controlled the many ways later generations would interpret or use the ideas he had helped organize. His book survived him, carried forward by the technology that had been transforming Europe during his lifetime. Paper.ink.metal type, a wooden press, the same process that spread scripture, classical literature, scientific ideas, political arguments, and poetry also spread the Malleus Maleficarum. Printing did not choose which ideas deserved to survive. It simply made survival easier. More than 5 centuries later, copies of the hammer still remain. The pages have darkened. Leather bindings have cracked. Margins contain notes written by readers whose names may now be forgotten. Some copies sit in university libraries and archives, protected behind glass and carefully turned by gloved hands. The book is no longer an instrument for prosecuting witches. It has become evidence of something else, a record of what fear can become when it is organized. The world that produced the Malleus Maleficarum was not populated by foolish people incapable of reason. It contained universities, trained lawyers, theologians, physicians, merchants, craftsmen, and complicated systems of law. Many of the people involved in witchcraft prosecutions sincerely believed they were protecting their community. Witnesses could sincerely believe that a curse had harmed them. Judges could sincerely believe that confession revealed truth. Clergy could sincerely believe that demons threatened Christian society, and sincere belief did not make the accusation. True, that may be the most unsettling part of the hammer's history. The machinery did not require everyone to be cruel. It required enough people to accept the same false premise. Once witchcraft was assumed to be real, unexplained illness could become evidence. Once witches were assumed to hide their crimes, the absence of evidence could become suspicious. Once denial was interpreted as deception, innocence became increasingly difficult to demonstrate. And once pain could be used to obtain confession, the stories authorities expected to find could emerge from the mouths of the accused themselves. Then those stories were written down, preserved, repeated, and believed. We return, finally, to the printing workshop where our story began. The room smells of paper, wood, oil, and fresh ink. Metal letters sit locked into place. A sheet is lowered onto the press. The mechanism tightens. For a moment, there is only the creak of timber under pressure. Then the press opens. Another page of the Malleus Maleficarum is complete. At the time, no one in that room can know how long those words will survive. The printer cannot see the trials of the next 2 centuries. The compositor cannot know which reader will eventually open this copy. Somewhere outside, church bells mark another ordinary hour. People move through streets, prepare meals, clothes. Shops tend animals, and return home as darkness settles over the roofs. The book leaves the workshop, One copy travels to a monastery, another to a scholar, another, perhaps to a judge. Years pass, then decades, then centuries. The accusations fade. The courts change. The fires eventually go out, but the hammer remains, not as proof that witches once hid throughout Europe, but as proof that people once built an elaborate system for believing they did. And beneath the candlelight of an archive, its pages are still. Wait in quiet now, unable to accuse anyone, unable to sentence anyone, only telling us what happened when fear, certainty, law, and the printed word were brought together. The Malleus Maleficarum promised its readers certainty in a world filled with uncertainty. It explains storms, sickness, infertility, death, and misfortune by giving those events an enemy. For generations, that explanation helped shape one of the darkest chapters in European history to today. The hammer belongs to history. The people accused by systems like the one Kramer defended cannot answer the records left behind. Many of their names survive only because someone once wrote an accusation beside them. But their stories remain, and so does the warning contained within them, that evidence matters, that doubt can have value, and that when a society becomes certain, an invisible enemy surrounds it. Even ordinary neighbors can begin to look dangerous. The candles burn lower, the old pages close, and for tonight, the hammer is silent. Thank you for listening to Whispering Tomes, obscure histories for sleep and relaxation. Until the next tome opens, rest well and let the past whisper you to sleep.